There are moments in war when a single man becomes an army, when one set of boots moving through mud and fire rewrites the course of a battle, and when courage crosses into something darker, more primal, more costly than anything history books will ever capture. What happened in a small French village on a cold November afternoon in 1944 should be impossible. A 22-year-old staff sergeant, acting without orders, without support, and without backup, walked alone into a fortified enemy position and fought for 2.5 hours against an entire German garrison. He moved through streets designed to kill him, turned their own weapons against them, and broke their will to fight while his own unit was still preparing to die in a frontal assault. This is not a legend. This is not exaggerated. This happened. And then, after surviving what no man should survive, he spent the rest of his life disappearing. The morning of November 13th began with rain. Not the cleansing kind, but the cold, penetrating drizzle that turns French soil into something between mud and quicksand, that finds every gap in wool and canvas, that makes rifles heavier and fingers slower. The men of Company C, 134th Infantry Regiment, 35th Infantry Division, had been fighting their way across northeastern France for weeks, through towns with names they couldn't pronounce, against an enemy that refused to break. The Wehrmacht was collapsing, everyone said. The war was almost over, everyone said. But the men dying in Lorraine didn't know that, and neither did the Germans still dug into every village, every hedgerow, every stone wall. Achain sat on low ground, a cluster of stone houses and farm buildings pressed together like huddled refugees, surrounded by open fields that offered no cover to anyone approaching from the east. The Germans had turned it into a strong point, one of dozens scattered across the region, each one a small fortress that had to be taken before the larger advance could continue. American intelligence had identified machine gun positions covering the main approach, mortars zeroed on likely assembly areas, snipers in upper windows. The village wasn't strategic in any grand sense. It didn't control a bridge or a crossroads. It was simply in the way, and men would die to take it because that's how ground wars work. Staff Sergeant Vito Bertoldo was a company runner, which meant he carried messages between command posts, scouted routes, and moved through terrain most infantrymen only saw from their foxholes. He was short, compact, with the kind of wiry build that hides surprising strength. He'd grown up in Illinois, the son of Italian immigrants, in a world where you learn to work hard and keep your head down. He wasn't a natural soldier in the Hollywood sense. He didn't give speeches or swagger, but he understood something fundamental about infantry combat that many men never learned. Movement is survival, and initiative is the difference between living and dying. The briefing that morning was straightforward in the way that terrible plans often are. Company C would advance across open ground from the east, supported by mortar fire and whatever artillery could be spared. They would close with the enemy, suppress the defensive positions, and clear the village house by house. Officers used words like aggressive and determined because they couldn't say suicidal and likely to fail. Everyone in that briefing knew what crossing those fields would cost. Everyone had seen it before. You go forward because those are the orders, because your friends are going forward, because stopping is not an option even when going forward is insane. Bertoldo listened, studied the approaches, looked at the terrain through the gray curtain of rain, and saw what the planners either missed or accepted as unavoidable. Every German gun was oriented east. Every position was designed to turn the main approach into a killing ground. The entire defensive scheme assumed the Americans would do exactly what they were about to do. Come straight in, pay the price in blood, and hope enough men survive to reach the village. It was logical. It was predictable. It was how these things usually went. But the western side of Achain, the side facing away from the American lines, was quiet. Not undefended, certainly, but not prepared for an assault. The Germans had concentrated their strength where it made sense, where the threat was obvious, where doctrine said the attack would come. They had left their back door unlocked. What happened next wasn't heroism in the moment. It was a decision, cold and calculated, made by a man who understood that individual initiative could break what mass assault could not. Bertoldo didn't ask permission. He didn't propose a flanking maneuver. He simply waited until the company began its preparations, then moved out on his own, heading north through a drainage ditch, using dead ground and scattered vegetation, circling wide around the village while his comrades were still checking ammunition and tightening chin straps. Moving alone through enemy territory is a specific kind of terror. You have no one watching your back. Every sound could be a patrol. Every bit of cover could hide a sniper. Your mind plays tricks, sees movement in shadows, hears footsteps in wind. Bertoldo moved slowly, carefully, pausing every few meters to listen, to watch, to let his senses map the space around him. He carried his M1 Garand, 8 rounds in the clip with extra ammunition in his belt and pockets. He had grenades. He had a trench knife. He had the skills that 18 months of combat had burned into his nervous system. The approach took over an hour. He used hedgerows, moved through waterlogged ditches, crawled across sections of open ground where standing would have silhouetted him against the gray sky. The rain helped, muffling sound, reducing visibility, giving him a cloak that no amount of camouflage could match. Every few minutes he stopped completely, pressing himself into whatever cover existed, listening not just with his ears but with his entire body, feeling for vibrations in the ground that might indicate vehicle movement or heavy equipment, watching for the telltale signs of observation posts or patrol routes. The mud clung to everything, adding pounds to his uniform, making every movement heavier, more exhausting. His hands were numb from cold and wet, and he had to consciously check his grip on his rifle, making sure he could still work the trigger, still operate the safety. The physical discomfort was constant but ignorable, background noise to the focused intensity of staying alive and undetected. He reached the western edge of Achain sometime after 11 in the morning, soaked, cold, breathing hard from the combination of exertion and adrenaline, crouched behind a stone wall that marked the boundary between farmland and village. From there, he could see into Achain. Stone houses with slate roofs, narrow streets, small courtyards. No civilians. They'd fled or been evacuated or were hiding in cellars. The architecture was typical of northeastern France. Buildings constructed to last centuries. Walls thick enough to stop small arms fire, windows narrow enough to defend. This village had probably seen armies before, had survived the First World War, had endured occupation and liberation and occupation again across generations. Now it was a battlefield, its purpose reduced to tactical value, its streets measured in fields of fire and covered approaches. German soldiers moved between buildings, but not with the alertness of men expecting attack from this direction. They were oriented east, focused on the fields where the Americans would appear, confident in their defensive plan. Bertoldo could see a machine gun position in a second-story window, the barrel just visible, angled to sweep the eastern approaches. He saw soldiers carrying ammunition crates toward the front-facing positions, reinforcing the defenses where they expected the attack. He saw an officer, recognizable by his bearing and the way others deferred to him, moving between positions, probably conducting a final inspection before the expected assault. Bertoldo watched them, counted them, memorized their patterns. He was one man against a reinforced garrison. The odds were insane. The plan, if you could call it that, was to create chaos, to pull defenders away from the main front, to turn the Germans' own defensive system against them. He went in fast and low, moving along the western edge of the village, using buildings for cover. His heart was hammering but his hands were steady. The paradox of combat stress where your body screams danger while your training takes over and moves you through the motions with mechanical precision. The first Germans he encountered were 2 soldiers standing near a doorway, smoking, rifles leaning against the wall. They were young, maybe younger than Bertoldo, talking in low voices about something he couldn't hear and didn't need to. They died before they understood what was happening. Bertoldo shot one through the chest, the M1's distinctive sound cracking through the afternoon, then swung and shot the other as he was turning toward the noise. 8-round clip, 6 rounds remaining. The bodies fell in the doorway, and Bertoldo was already moving, not running but moving with purpose, turning into a side street, heading deeper into the village. Behind him, the 2 dead Germans would be discovered within minutes, but by then he'd be somewhere else, creating new problems in new locations. The sound of gunfire brought reaction, but not coordinated response. The Germans knew someone was shooting, but they didn't know where, didn't know how many, didn't know if this was a scout or the vanguard of an assault. Bertoldo used that confusion. He moved constantly, never staying in one position, firing from one location and appearing in another, creating the impression of multiple attackers. He found a machine gun position set up to cover the eastern approach. 3 men in a reinforced corner building, the gun pointed out a window toward the American lines. He came at them from behind, through a door they hadn't bothered to secure, killed the crew before they could swing the weapon around, then pushed the gun over and moved on. Combat at this range alone becomes something beyond tactics. It's instinct and reaction, reading situations in split seconds, making decisions that would take minutes to explain but happen in heartbeats. There's no time to think through options, no time to weigh consequences. You see, you assess, you act, and if you're wrong you die, and if you're right you move to the next situation where you'll make another split-second decision. Bertoldo saw a German soldier step out of a building 15 meters away, saw the moment of recognition in the man's eyes, the fractional widening that comes with surprise, shot him before he could raise his rifle. The German fell backward into the doorway he'd just exited. 4 rounds left in the clip. Bertoldo took a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, let the spoon fly, counted 1-2, threw it through a ground-floor window where he'd seen movement, heard the explosion and the screams that followed, kept moving. He was operating on multiple levels simultaneously, tracking ammunition, tracking his position in the village, tracking time in the vague sense of knowing that every minute he fought was a minute his company was getting closer to launching their assault. He picked up a German MP-40 submachine gun from a dead soldier, checked the magazine, found it nearly full, 32 rounds of 9mm ammunition. He slung his garrison across his back and carried the MP-40 at the ready. Different weapon, different characteristics. The MP-40 had a slower rate of fire than American submachine guns, but it was reliable and the ammunition was everywhere, available from every German soldier he killed or bypassed. The village became a maze of violence. Every corner could hide death. Every door could open onto enemy soldiers. Every window might conceal a sniper who'd been watching his approach and was now lining up a shot. The cognitive load was immense, processing sensory information constantly, filtering threat from background, staying oriented in unfamiliar terrain while under stress that would paralyze most people. Bertoldo moved through Achain like something feral, not reckless but absolutely committed, understanding that his only advantage was momentum, that the moment he stopped moving, the moment he let the Germans organize, he was finished. He destroyed another machine gun nest, this one set up in a barn, the gun positioned to fire through the main door which stood half open toward the eastern fields. 3-man crew, 2 feeding ammunition and 1 on the trigger. They heard him coming but didn't have time to swing the heavy weapon around before he was inside the barn. Firing the MP-40 from his hip, the controlled burst cutting down all 3 men in the space of 2 seconds. Blood on the straw-covered floor. The gun itself was a German MG-42, one of the most effective machine guns of the war, capable of firing over 1,000 rounds per minute. It sounds so distinctive that Allied soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw. This gun wouldn't be cutting down American soldiers today. Bertoldo killed the crew and dragged the gun outside, disabled it by removing the bolt and throwing it into a well. He shot Germans who were running to defensive positions, killed them in doorways, in alleys, in the open spaces between buildings where they thought they were safe because those spaces faced inward, away from the American approach. Time loses meaning in combat. Minutes feel like hours. Hours compress into moments. Your sense of duration becomes disconnected from the actual passage of time because you're processing so much information, making so many decisions, that your brain can't maintain normal temporal tracking. Bertoldo had no watch, no way to track how long he'd been fighting, no way to know if his company had started their assault or was still waiting in their assembly areas, going through final equipment checks and listening to last-minute instructions from squad leaders. He just kept moving, kept fighting, trusting that eventually his actions would create enough chaos to matter, that the cumulative effect of destroyed positions and dead defenders would add up to something that changed the tactical situation. He was wounded at some point, a piece of shrapnel or a ricochet that cut across his shoulder, not deep enough to stop him but enough to hurt, enough to add his own blood to the rain and mud coating his uniform. The wound burned, sharp and hot, different from the cold ache of exhaustion. He barely noticed. Pain was information, nothing more, telling him he was still alive and still capable of moving. He'd been trained to push through wounds unless they were immediately incapacitating, to keep fighting until you couldn't, because stopping usually meant dying anyway. The Germans began to understand they were fighting something they hadn't prepared for. Radio calls went out, confused reports of an attack from the rear, requests for clarification, orders that couldn't be executed because the situation kept changing faster than anyone could respond. The German defense had been built around a specific assumption, a specific plan, and now that plan was collapsing in real time. Soldiers who had been focused on the eastern defenses, who had been told to expect an American assault across open ground, who had been mentally preparing for that specific battle, suddenly found themselves under attack from inside their own perimeter. The psychological impact was significant. When you know where the enemy is, when you understand the battlefield geometry, you can manage fear, can function despite it. But when the threat is everywhere and nowhere, when soldiers are dying behind you while you're focused forward, when your defensive positions are being destroyed from angles they weren't designed to defend against, panic becomes a real possibility. Casualties mounted. The steady accumulation of dead and wounded, of destroyed equipment, of positions that went silent when they should have been reporting ready. Machine guns that should have been covering the American approach were silent, their crews dead or scattered, the weapons disabled or captured. A truck that had been positioned to move reinforcements, a 3/4-ton Opel Blitz that could carry a dozen soldiers to wherever they were needed, exploded when Bertoldo shot the fuel tank, the fireball rising into the gray sky like a signal flare, black smoke pouring from the wreckage. The explosion was visible from the American lines, and soldiers preparing for the assault saw it and wondered what it meant, what was happening inside the village they were about to attack. The defensive coordination that makes a strong point effective began to collapse. Orders couldn't reach their destinations because runners were getting killed or pinned down. Men didn't know where to go, what to defend, where the threat was coming from. Junior officers tried to organize responses, but they were working with incomplete information, making decisions based on reports that were already outdated by the time they arrived. And then, as Bertoldo worked his way through the southern section of the village, moving from building to building with the MP40 in his hands and his garand still slung across his back as backup, he heard American voices. Distant at first, carried on the wind mixed with the sound of small arms fire, but unmistakable. English, American accents, the particular cadence of American soldiers in combat. The assault had begun. Company C was coming across those fields, moving through the fire that should have been overwhelming but was now fragmented, confused, pulled in multiple directions. The suppressing fire that should have pinned them in the open was sporadic, disorganized. The interlocking fields of fire that should have created a killing zone were full of gaps because the guns that should have been firing were destroyed or abandoned. The Germans who should have been pouring disciplined fire into the advancing Americans were instead trying to figure out what was happening in their rear, trying to reorganize, trying to respond to an attack that made no tactical sense. Squad leaders were shouting contradictory orders. Some men were told to hold their positions facing east while others were pulled back to deal with the threat from within. The cohesion that separates an effective defensive position from a collection of scared men with guns was breaking down, and once that process starts it's nearly impossible to stop. Bertoldo didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He pushed harder, understanding that this was the moment, that the breakthrough depended on maintaining pressure from both sides, that if he let up now the Germans might recover their composure and the American assault would face the full weight of prepared defenses. He killed more Germans, caught them as they were repositioning, shot them from angles they weren't watching because they were focused on the threat from the east. He forced others to surrender by appearing where they thought they were safe, by making them believe they were surrounded, by creating the impression that American forces had already broken through in strength and that continued resistance was pointless. Psychological warfare at the individual level, the kind that happens in the moments when soldiers decide whether to fight to the death or throw down their weapons. He found himself in a courtyard, 3 enemy soldiers coming at him from different directions, converging on his position from 3 separate doorways like they'd coordinated the movement. Maybe they had. Maybe they'd finally figured out there was one man causing all this chaos and had decided to trap him. It didn't matter. Bertoldo dropped all 3 in the space of seconds, pure reaction, muscle memory trained by months of combat where the difference between fast and slow was the difference between living and dying. He shot the one on his left first because that soldier was raising his rifle fastest, then swung right and shot that one. Then center, 3 distinct trigger pulls, 3 bodies falling, 3 lives ending before his brain consciously processed what his body was doing. One of them wounded him again. A bullet that grazed his leg, cut through uniform and skin, burned like someone had laid a hot iron across his thigh. The impact was enough to make him stumble but not fall, enough to add another injury to the accumulating damage, but didn't break bone, didn't stop movement. He kept going, limping now but still moving, still fighting, still refusing to give the Germans time to organize. The Americans pushed into Achain from the east. The fighting became more conventional, squad against squad, building by building, the kind of urban combat that favors defenders but only when the defenders are organized and supplied and not being torn apart from within. Squads moved in fire teams, one team providing covering fire while the other advanced, then switching roles, the basic tactics of infantry assault that had been practiced until they became automatic. Sergeants shouted orders and soldiers executed them, moving with the practice coordination that comes from training together, fighting together, surviving together. The Germans in Achain were none of those things. They fought hard in some pockets, fought desperately in some cases, individual acts of courage by men who refused to surrender even when the situation was clearly lost. German soldiers were as capable as any, as brave as any, and many of them had been fighting longer than most Americans, had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front before being transferred west. But their cohesion was broken. Their defensive plan had collapsed. Their leaders were dead or out of communication. Their prepared positions had been destroyed or bypassed. They were fighting as individuals or small groups, not as a coordinated unit, and individual courage can't compensate for systemic failure. Some surrendered, hands up, rifles on the ground, the universal gesture of submission that transcends language and uniform. Some retreated, fell back to secondary positions or simply fled the village entirely, disappearing into the countryside where they'd be captured later or make their way back to German lines. Some died in place, fighting until they were killed, their bodies left where they fell among the rubble and wreckage of the village. Bertoldo kept fighting until there was nothing left to fight. He moved through the village until he encountered American troops, until he was sure the position was secure, until his body finally acknowledged the exhaustion and damage it had been ignoring for the past 2.5 hours. The adrenaline that had been sustaining him began to fade, and with it came the full realization of what he'd done, what he'd survived, what he'd endured. His uniform was soaked with rain and sweat and blood, some his, most not. His hands were shaking, the fine tremor that comes after extreme stress, after your body has been running on emergency power for too long. He was wounded in multiple places, none of them life-threatening but all of them painful, the kind of pain that becomes impossible to ignore once the immediate threat is gone. He had been inside Achain for 2.5 hours, alone, fighting continuously, moving constantly, making split-second decisions that determined whether he lived or died dozens of times over. He had personally killed approximately 25 German soldiers, shot them at ranges from a few meters to across a street, killed them with rifle fire and submachine gun bursts and grenades, killed them efficiently and without hesitation because hesitation would have meant his own death. He had destroyed multiple machine gun positions, eliminated the prepared defenses that should have shredded Company C's assault. He had disabled vehicles and weapons, captured enemy soldiers who had thrown down their rifles and surrendered rather than continue fighting an enemy they couldn't pin down or predict. He had shattered the village's defensive system without support, without reinforcement, without any of the things that military doctrine says are necessary for this kind of operation. He had done what should have been impossible, what no training manual suggests, what no reasonable person would have attempted, what no commander would have ordered because the expected outcome was death. When his officers finally understood what had happened, when they pieced together the timeline and realized that one man had taken apart a fortified position from the inside while they were preparing their assault, the response was something between disbelief and awe. Combat veterans are not easily impressed. They've seen too much, lost too many friends, witnessed too many failures disguised as heroism. But what Bertoldo had done was undeniable. The evidence was there in the destroyed positions, the dead Germans, the captured weapons, the testimonies of soldiers who had watched him fight. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration the United States awards. It's given for actions that go beyond courage, beyond duty, into territory where military vocabulary fails. Most recipients die earning it. Most actions that warrant it are witnessed by few and understood by fewer. The bureaucracy that processes such recommendations is slow, thorough, skeptical. It requires statements, evidence, verification. It takes months, sometimes years. Bertoldo received the Medal of Honor in 1945, presented by a general whose name has been lost to time, in a ceremony that probably felt surreal after everything that had preceded it. The medal itself is a beautiful object, bronze and silk ribbon, heavy with symbolism and history. It represents the nation's highest recognition of military valor. It comes with certain benefits, modest pension, veterans preference, the kind of practical considerations that seem small next to the weight of what was done to earn it. And then Vito Bertoldo went home. He returned to a country that was celebrating victory, that was ready to forget the war, that was flooding with veterans trying to rebuild normal lives from the wreckage of combat experience. For some men, the transition works. They find purpose, build families, carry their service as a private matter. For others, the gap between who they were in combat and who they're expected to be in civilian life becomes unbridgeable. Bertoldo struggled. He married, but the marriage failed. He worked various jobs, but nothing stuck. He drank heavily and consistently, the kind of drinking that's self-medication for trauma that doesn't have a name yet, for memories that don't fade, for skills that have no civilian application. He moved frequently, drifting through Illinois, disconnected from family, from community, from the structures that give life stability. His Medal of Honor, the physical object, disappeared at some point. Sold, lost, pawned, stolen. The details are unclear because by that point, his life was unclear. The American relationship with veterans is complicated. We celebrate military service in abstract. We honor the concept of sacrifice. We wave flags and say thank you for your service and mean it, mostly. But the actual work of caring for veterans, of acknowledging what combat does to human beings, of providing the support systems that might prevent someone like Bertoldo from disappearing into alcoholism and poverty, that work is harder, less dramatic, less amenable to ceremonies and parades. Bertoldo died in 1966. He was 44 years old. The cause of death is not widely recorded, but men who drink like he drank and live like he lived don't usually die old. He was buried with minimal attention, no headlines, no recognition of what he'd done 2 decades earlier. His family had scattered. His medals were gone. His story was known to a few veterans, a few historians, and no one else. Years passed. Decades passed. His Medal of Honor, that physical object worth far more than its materials, surfaced in an estate sale or pawn shop or some similar place where history gets reduced to transaction. Someone recognized what it was, traced the name, found the story, contacted the family. The medal was returned to Bertoldo's relatives long after his death, a small redemption that came too late to matter to him. This is not an unusual story. Thousands of veterans have fought with extraordinary courage, survived, and then been destroyed by peace. The skill set that keeps you alive in combat, the hypervigilance, the aggression, the ability to make split-second decisions involving life and death, those don't translate well to civilian life. They become liabilities. They become symptoms. They become reasons you can't hold a job, can't maintain relationships, can't sleep, can't stop drinking. What Bertoldo did in Achain was remarkable by any standard. Military historians who study the battle note the audacity of his approach, the tactical sophistication of his execution, the physical courage required to sustain that kind of solo combat for 2.5 hours. He didn't just survive. He succeeded. He achieved a battlefield objective that should have required a platoon, did it alone, did it effectively, did it in a way that directly saved American lives by disrupting German defenses before the main assault. But courage in combat doesn't grant immunity to everything that comes after. It doesn't cure trauma. It doesn't pay bills. It doesn't fill the silence of civilian life for men who spent years living at the edge of death. The medal Bertoldo earned was real. The recognition was real. And none of it was enough to prevent his life from falling apart. There's a tendency in military history to focus on the battle, to end the story with victory, to let the narrative close with the award ceremony or the return home. It's cleaner that way. It's more satisfying. It lets us celebrate courage without confronting cost. But the real story doesn't end with the battle. The real story continues through decades of struggle, through failed attempts at normalcy, through the slow erosion of a man who survived the impossible but couldn't survive peace. The village of Achain still exists. It's a quiet place, a few dozen houses, a church farmland stretching in all directions. There's probably no marker indicating what happened there in November 1944. Most villages in France have seen violence across centuries. World War II was just one chapter in a long history of armies moving through, fighting over ground that looks different now but occupies the same geography. The residents of modern Achain likely don't know about Bertoldo. Why would they? It was one day, one battle in a war that killed millions. Memory is selective. History is written by whoever has the time and resources to write it. The big stories survive, the famous battles, the generals, the turning points. The small stories, the individual actions of soldiers whose names don't appear in high school textbooks, those fade unless someone makes an effort to preserve them. And even when preserved, they exist in archives, in obscure books, in the memories of aging veterans who were there, who knew the man, who remember what actually happened before the simplification begins. What makes Bertoldo's story worth remembering is not that he was unique. Other soldiers performed similar acts of courage. Other men earned the Medal of Honor. Other veterans struggled with alcohol and poverty and obscurity. What makes it worth remembering is what it reveals about the gap between the moment of action and the lifetime that follows, between the recognition society offers and the support it withholds, between the heroism we celebrate and the consequences we ignore. He was 22 years old when he fought in Achain. 22, doing something that sounds fictional when described, that seems impossible until you read the after-action reports and testimony. He was 44 when he died, worn out, forgotten, disconnected from the moment that should have defined his life in a positive way but instead seems to have marked him for something darker. There are no easy lessons here. You can't draw a straight line from Achain to his death and say this caused that. Human beings are more complicated than simple causation. But you can note the pattern, the repetition, the number of men who survived combat and then didn't survive civilian life, who earned recognition and then disappeared, who did everything their country asked and got very little in return. The Medal of Honor that was eventually returned to his family sits somewhere now, in a case or a drawer, a piece of metal and ribbon that represents one afternoon in France when a young man did something extraordinary. It doesn't tell the whole story. No medal can. It marks a moment, not a life. And the life that followed, the decades of struggle and decline, that's part of the story too, maybe the more important part, the part that's harder to tell and less satisfying to hear. We build monuments to battles. We name ships and bases after generals. We create museums and memorials. We do the work of remembering at scale, in ways that organize history into narratives we can understand. But the individual stories, the soldiers whose actions were witnessed by only a few, whose names don't attach to famous victories, whose later lives don't fit the narrative of triumphant return, those slip away unless someone chooses to hold on. This is one of those stories. A man named Vito Bertoldo fought alone inside a German-held village in 1944, achieved something remarkable, survived, received recognition, and then spent 22 years slowly disappearing until death made the disappearance permanent. His medal was lost and found. His story was known and forgotten and partially remembered. He was a hero and he was a casualty, and those things are not contradictory. The rain that fell on Achain in November 1944 has long since soaked into the ground. The men who fought there are mostly dead now on both sides. The buildings that were damaged have been repaired or replaced. The fields where soldiers died grow crops. Life continues as it always does, indifferent to history. But the actions remain part of the record, retrievable for anyone willing to look, to read the citations, to imagine what it meant to move through that village alone, fighting an entire garrison, achieving the impossible. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the story survives not because of monuments or memorials, but because someone reads it, thinks about it, passes it on. Maybe remembering is the only counter we have to forgetting, the only way to honor not just the heroism but the cost, not just the battle but the aftermath, not just the moment but the life. If this story means anything to you, if it makes you think about courage and consequence, about what we ask of soldiers and what we owe them after, if it makes you pause even briefly to consider the gap between recognition and support, then perhaps it's worth sharing. Like this video if you think stories like Bertoldo's deserve to be told. Subscribe if you want to hear more about the forgotten soldiers, the small battles, the individual actions that don't make it into the big history books. And tell me in the comments, what do we owe veterans who survive the war but struggle with peace? How do we honor not just the moment of courage but the decades that follow? How do we remember the men who did everything right in battle and everything they could after, even when it wasn't enough? These are not rhetorical questions. They matter. And the answers, whatever they are, start with remembering that soldiers like Vito Bertoldo existed, fought, survived, struggled, and deserve more than obscurity.